The memory of lost continents is defined by sudden violence and falling skies. History conditions the modern mind to envision great land bridges collapsing beneath crushing waves in mere hours, an apocalypse immortalized in global folklore. Yet the most profound vanishing acts orchestrated by nature operate in absolute, creeping silence. Tonight, the narrative descends into the cold depths to trace a forgotten realm that drowned so gently its inhabitants simply walked away from the rising tides. Before this journey begins, deep gratitude is owed to everyone who quietly listens and patiently waits. Tens of thousands of years ago, the earth was locked in a profound and silent stillness, wrapped in a shimmering mantle of ancient ice. The great oceans, which now dictate the shape of modern continents, were vastly diminished, their waters stolen by colossal glaciers that stretched for thousands of miles across the northern hemisphere. In this frozen epoch, the maps of the world we know today were entirely unrecognizable and drawn not by the borders of sweeping tides, but by endless plains of frost and windswept tundra. The receding waters laid bare the secret architecture of the ocean floor, exposing massive bridges of solid earth that connected entirely different corners of the globe. These were not mere strips of mud, but vast continents in their own right, offering passage across territories that are now swallowed by dark, unforgiving waters. The quiet majesty of this period was defined by an unbroken expanse where the horizon stretched infinitely over solid ground. The pale sun hung low over plains that seemed to go on forever, casting long, ghostly shadows across landscapes that belonged entirely to the megafauna. It was a time when the earth breathed slowly, holding its frozen breath under the immense weight of towering ice sheets. While underneath the grey skies, a vast network of forgotten lands united a fragmented world. Far to the west, in a desolate stretch of the northern world, one of these monumental bridges forged a path that would forever alter the course of human history. Between the rugged coasts of Siberia and the untamed wilderness of modern-day Alaska, the sea had retreated to reveal Beringia, a sprawling steppe of immense proportions. This was a rugged, windswept grassland, carpeted with hardy sagebrush and pale mosses that thrived in the bitter chill of the Pleistocene epoch. Across this endless frozen prairie, immense herds of woolly mammoths and ancient bison lumbered through the mist, their heavy hooves pounding against soil that now rests deep beneath the frigid waves of the Bering Strait. Following these magnificent beasts were the ancestors of the first Americans, nomadic hunters clad in thick furs, and stepping silently across a world that felt as permanent as the stars above them. They built their fires on lands that seemed invincible, tracing the contours of a continent that offered a vital corridor to a new hemisphere. The story of Beringia is deeply woven into the ancient memory of the Americas, standing as a testament to a magnificent world that was ultimately reclaimed by the relentless rise of the ocean. The people who walked that land bridge could never have fathomed that the solid earth beneath their feet, the vast plains where they camped and hunted, was merely a fleeting illusion destined to be drowned by the melting glaciers. Yet, across the great expanse of the Atlantic, mirroring the frozen majesty of Beringia, another forgotten empire of earth lay quietly waiting in the shadows of the European continent. While the nomadic tribes were making their legendary crossing into the Americas, a remarkably similar phenomenon had birthed a massive territory in the east, bridging the jagged coastlines of ancient Britain and the sprawling mainland of Europe. Where the turbulent grey waters of the North Sea now endlessly churn, there existed an uninterrupted continuation of the land, a sweeping basin of rolling hills, deep valleys and winding rivers. This was not a barren wasteland of ice, but a remarkably fertile expanse that acted as the very heart of the prehistoric European landscape. The glaciers to the north acted as towering sentinels, holding back the sea and allowing a rich, complex topography to emerge from the shallow seabed. Massive river systems, carrying the meltwater from distant mountains, carved deep arteries through this territory, creating a vibrant network of wetlands and forested ridges. It was a vast, unbroken horizon that united distant shores, a place where one could walk continuously from the chalky cliffs of the west, deep into the dense, primeval forests of the eastern mainland, without ever seeing a single wave of salt water. This magnificent lost continent, which would much later be named Doggerland, existed in a state of quiet grace, completely oblivious to the fragility of its own existence. Yet the tribes that wandered its immense valleys and camped along its freshwater streams believed they were standing on eternal ground, sheltered by the immense ice walls that defined the northern boundaries of their known universe. The land was firm, the rivers flowed steadily, and the sprawling forests seemed rooted deep enough to outlast time itself. But the peace held here rested on an imbalance that would not last forever, and a silent devastation was already gathering beneath the melting ice. Yes. The secret to this magnificent expanse lay in the colossal architecture of the Ice Age itself. As the northern glaciers absorbed unimaginable volumes of water, the shallow basin of the North Sea was completely drained in. It revealed a sprawling seabed that had long been locked away in darkness. This was a slow, majestic unveiling of a landscape that stretched across an astonishing 260,000 square kilometres. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of this ancient realm, one must look closely at modern maps. It was a territory significantly larger than the entirety of the United Kingdom rising proudly from the depths. This was a boundless kingdom of earth and stone that seamlessly stitched the jagged edges of the British Isles to continental Europe. The geography of the ancient world was dramatically rewritten by the freezing temperatures, turning isolated landmasses into a continuous continent. There were no treacherous straits to cross or turbulent tides to navigate. It was simply a vast and solid horizon that invited endless migration across the prehistoric world. For a modern mind to truly grasp the scale of this lost world, a familiar comparison is incredibly helpful. One might envision the sprawling, rugged dimensions of the state of Colorado to understand the sheer physical space. Doggerland possessed that exact same overwhelming vastness, stretching endlessly beneath a heavy, silver sky. It was a staggering expanse of varied topography that could easily swallow entire modern nations within its ancient borders. This was a monumental plateau of existence, where the concept of an isolated island was entirely foreign. It rendered ancient Britain merely a rugged western peninsula, attached to a much greater European whole. The endless plains rolled gently into the distance, painted with the muted greens and browns of a primeval wilderness. This immense land bridge was not a narrow, fragile strip of mud clinging to the continental edges. It was a robust and formidable heartland that commanded the very centre of the ancient landscape. It possessed its own distinct weather patterns, its own mountain ridges, and its own deep, echoing valleys. The sheer volume of exposed earth created a profound sense of permanence that completely belied the fragile geological balance holding the oceans at bay. Deep within this sweeping territory, a complex and beautiful anatomy of nature was meticulously carved by flowing water. The colossal river systems of the era did not simply empty into the ocean as they do today. Instead, the ancestors of the modern Thames, the Rhine, and the Seine converged into a massive twisting network. These powerful freshwater veins pulsed continuously through the very heart of the sprawling Doggerland expanse. These mighty rivers joined forces to carve deep, winding gorges through the soft chalk and heavy compacted clay. Their waters eventually spilled into a massive, shimmering freshwater lake that completely dominated the northern section of the basin. The resulting landscape was a breathtaking mosaic of plunging waterfalls, serene marshlands, and fiercely fertile, expanding estuaries. Thick layers of rich sediment carried down from the distant alpine peaks settled evenly across the endless plains. This slow, deliberate accumulation over millennia transformed the former ocean floor into a remarkably fertile canvas for biological development. It was an environment perfectly engineered for abundance, a geographical masterpiece sculpted by the unyielding hands of time. The earth was soft, the waters were plentiful, and the sheltered valleys offered deep protection from the bitter northern winds. The true majesty of this forgotten topography remained entirely hidden from human knowledge for countless generations. It was only when modern science began to meticulously peel back the heavy layers of the sea that the truth finally emerged. Through advanced mapping and deep-sea core sampling, the Europe's Lost Frontiers project at the University of Bradford changed everything. These dedicated researchers painstakingly reconstructed the ghostly, undulating contours of this magnificent sunken empire beneath the waves. Detailed findings published in the prestigious journal Antiquity in the year 2020 revealed a staggering three-dimensional portrait of Doggerland, Bioswan. The groundbreaking research definitively confirmed the existence of towering hills and deep, meandering riverbeds that could easily support a flourishing biosphere. The acoustic data captured from the ocean floor paints an incredibly vivid picture of a highly dynamic and textured landscape. It was a world characterized by dramatic coastal cliffs and gentle, rolling valleys that perfectly trapped the ambient warmth of the sun. It is a profoundly sobering realization that beneath the cold, grey waves of the modern North Sea lies this perfect topographical map. The massive geological foundations were firmly set, and the endless fertile plains were quietly waiting to be claimed. This vast, silent kingdom had been beautifully prepared by the forces of the earth, and it was about to become the stage for a spectacular explosion of life. As the pale morning sun crested the distant horizon, it illuminated a prehistoric world that was overwhelmingly green and fiercely alive. The cool air was incredibly heavy with the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine resin and senis. This fragrance mixed intimately with the rich, damp earth of endless sprawling wetlands. Vast untamed forests of resilient birch and towering pine stretched continuously across the fertile plains, creating a dense, protective canopy that whispered softly in the gentle northern breeze. This was the vibrant heart of the Mesolithic era, a time when the landscape breathed with a profound and untroubled vitality. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the winding riverbanks, eventually burning off to reveal a breathtaking mosaic of serene marshlands and deeply shaded woodlands. Every leaf and blade of tall grass held heavy drops of dew that sparkled like scattered diamonds under the warming light of the new day, and the silence of the dawn was never empty. It was rather filled with the complex, overlapping melodies of countless migratory birds claiming the expansive wetlands as their own. It was a deeply peaceful sanctuary where the slow rhythms of nature dictated the passage of time without any interruption. This sprawling territory was far from an empty wilderness. It was a thriving, pulsing ecosystem, perfectly adapted to the welcoming warmth of the post-glacial period. Beneath the dappled shade of the ancient trees, massive creatures roamed with an unquestioned and majestic sovereignty over the soft earth. Great herds of magnificent red deer moved with a quiet, deliberate grace through the thick, vibrant underbrush of the deep forest. The sharp sound of their heavy, branching antlers occasionally scraping against the low-hanging birch branches provided a rhythmic percussion to the woodland ambience. Further out in the open floodplains, the heavy and rhythmic thud of solitary mammoths echoed softly across the damp marshlands. They stood as lingering testaments to the retreating ice age. These gentle giants navigated the lush topography with ease, their massive forms moving steadily through the deep river valleys in search of fresh vegetation. The rivers themselves teemed with an astonishing variety of freshwater life. They served as vital arteries that sustained the heavy concentration of animals gathering along their muddy banks. Predators and prey alike were locked in an ancient, balanced dance of survival, all nourished by the unparalleled fertility of a land that seemed to offer endless resources. Woven seamlessly into this rich tapestry of unbridled nature were the human inhabitants. These were the deeply resourceful hunter-gatherers who called this vast expanse their home. Small, tightly knit nomadic bands moved with quiet purpose through the intricate, twisting network of deeply carved rivers and fiercely fertile estuaries. They did not seek to conquer this wild landscape, but instead lived in a delicate, respectful harmony with its shifting seasons and natural migrations. As the long day transitioned into a cool evening, the thin blue smoke from small, carefully tended hearths curled gently into the twilight sky. The evening breeze carried the rich, comforting aroma of roasted meat and freshly gathered wild herbs through the peaceful encampments nestled in the sheltered valleys. Families worked harmoniously by the water's edge, utilizing finely crafted tools of chipped flint and polished bone to harvest the immense, reliable bounty of the surrounding lakes. Children learned the ancient paths of the red deer, while elders quietly shared the generational knowledge required to navigate the dense pine forests safely. It was an existence defined by a profound intimacy with the earth, where every subtle change in the wind or the behaviour of the birds was read with absolute clarity. The sheer breathtaking richness of this biological canvas has not simply been imagined, rather meticulously reconstructed by the tireless efforts of modern scholars. Extensive research compiled by the dedicated experts at the Flanders Marine Institute has painstakingly mapped out the exact botanical and zoological composition of this vibrant lost Eden. Detailed findings published within the prestigious Journal of Archaeological Science between the years 2017 and 2021 paint a remarkably vivid picture of this ecosystem. The deep and heavy core samples pulled directly from the modern ocean floor consistently reveal a prehistoric environment that was uniquely equipped to support a massive, diverse population. Traces of ancient pollen and preserved animal bones trapped deep within the dark layers of peat confirm the overwhelming presence of those vast pine forests and marshlands. This scientific evidence definitively proves that this sunken territory was a true paradise of the prehistoric world, a geographical masterpiece engineered for total biological abundance. It was a remarkably stable sanctuary where human and animal life flourished beautifully side by side under the gentle warming of the Holocene epoch. But this breathtaking abundance was built on a foundation that was already melting away. The transformation of this vibrant ancient paradise did not arrive with the sudden violent roar of a collapsing mountain. It was instead an agonizingly slow, almost imperceptible thief that systematically stole the solid ground from those who walked it. Around 20,000 years ago, the colossal ancient ice sheets dominating the northern hemisphere began their long, inevitable retreat. They yielded slowly to a steadily warming atmosphere that fundamentally and permanently changed the global climate. The very same climatic shift that had breathed magnificent life into Doggerland was now orchestrating its watery demise. Billions of gallons of frozen freshwater were released from their icy prisons, flowing relentlessly back into the global ocean. This continuous influx caused a steady, creeping rise in sea levels that permanently altered the ancient world. It was a truly invisible, quiet tragedy. The shift unfolded so gradually that a single human lifetime might only witness the loss of a few coastal markers. The shoreline advanced mere centimetres each year, provoking no immediate, widespread panic. Yet, this subtle movement promised an absolute, inescapable doom over the span of centuries. For the countless generations of resourceful hunter-gatherers, the changing world required a quiet, continuous surrender of ancestral lands. An elder sitting quietly by the evening hearth might vividly recall tracking mighty aurochs. They remembered deep, sheltered woodlands that now lay completely submerged beneath the salty tide. These elders would mournfully pass down ancient memories of sacred gathering places. They spoke of massive stone markers that had been slowly swallowed by the advancing grey waves. The children of those wise elders would grow up accepting a new, higher coastline. They would then watch that very boundary creep even further inland by the time their own hair turned grey. The peaceful encampments securely nestled by the edges of shimmering lakes had to be meticulously disassembled. Families were forced to carry their hearths and homes toward higher elevations. It was a sombre, silent retreat played out across countless human lifetimes. This was a slow, inevitable march away from a creeping abyss that could not be reasoned with or fought. The nomadic people did not mourn a sudden apocalypse, but endured the persistent ache of a shrinking universe. They continuously bid a reluctant farewell to the fertile hunting grounds their grandfathers had known so intimately. As the merciless saltwater intruded further into the vibrant heartland, the delicate balance of the Mesolithic ecosystem unravelled. The grand, twisting freshwater rivers that had carved life-giving gorges into the chalky earth slowly turned brackish. Magnificent, sprawling forests of ancient pine and resilient birch were suddenly suffocated by the heavy rising salinity. The encroaching sea ruthlessly drowned the deep root systems of these towering giants. It left behind vast haunting stretches of ghostly skeletal trees standing bare against the fading evening sky. These petrified forests became silent sentinels guarding the encroaching shoreline. Their bleached trunks reflected the pale light of the northern sun, like ancient bones scattered across the muddy marsh. The fiercely fertile estuaries that had provided a reliable bounty of life transformed into treacherous, shifting mudflats. These desolate coastal strips soon offered absolutely no sustenance to the wandering tribes. The rich, peaty soil that had nurtured extraordinary flora was systematically eroded by the undeniable pull of relentless tides. Magnificent animals that had safely roamed the expansive plains were slowly driven out of their familiar grazing territories. They desperately sought refuge in the ever-dwindling highlands, fleeing the unstoppable ascent of the hungry ocean. The sheer scale of this agonizing geographical contraction is profoundly difficult for the modern mind to fully comprehend. One must actively visualize the crushing weight of immense time bearing down heavily upon the vulnerable landscape. Deep, sheltering valleys that had once echoed beautifully with human laughter simply slipped beneath the cold waves. They were permanently erased from the physical world, leaving no trace of the warmth they once held. The profound tragedy of Doggerland lay in this entirely helpless observation of a thriving world fading into dark oblivion. Every passing century systematically erased thousands of square kilometres of perfectly habitable land. The map of the Earth was being rewritten with cold, unforgiving precision by the rising waters. The great, robust land bridge, connecting the rugged edges of Britain to the European continent, was dissolving into memory. What was once a seemingly infinite horizon of green plains was replaced by a monotonous, churning grey ocean. The human inhabitants found their boundless kingdom steadily stripped away by the unrelenting tides. They were left clutching desperately to the remaining elevated ridges of their fading ancestral home. The slow and deliberate encroachment of the sea was incredibly patient, but it was meticulously preparing to trap them in a shrinking geographical corner from which there would be absolutely no escape. The grand, sweeping plains that once stretched boundlessly across the horizon were now nothing more than a fading ancestral myth. Thousands of years of relentless glacial melt had violently redrawn the maps of the ancient world, reducing a mighty continent into a fragile, solitary speck known as Dogger Island. What remained of the once magnificent land bridge was a deeply isolated archipelago. It was severed from the mainland of Europe and the rugged cliffs of Britain. The sprawling, life-giving freshwater river systems that had nurtured countless generations were entirely swallowed by the intrusion of the cold, northern ocean. The surviving landscape was a drastically compressed sanctuary in a narrow strip of high ground surrounded on all sides by an expanse of grey water. The encroaching tides had mercilessly pushed the physical boundaries of existence inward, forcing every living creature into a claustrophobic exile upon the highest remaining ridges. The inhabitants woke each morning to a horizon that offered no escape, seeing only the rhythmic churning of the sea that had already consumed their history. Now, the physical reality of their world had been fundamentally fractured. The infinite freedom of the deep continental interior was replaced by the suffocating reality of a maritime prison. The extraordinary megafauna that once roamed the endless green valleys could no longer be found within this shrinking territory. The herds of mighty aurochs and giant deer had vanished entirely. They had either perished in the encroaching marshes or retreated to distant mainlands long before the final land connections dissolved. In their place, the isolated ecosystem supported only a meagre population of smaller, resilient creatures. These animals had adapted to the harsh, salt-heavy winds sweeping off the relentless ocean. The lush, towering forests of ancient pine and birch were completely stripped away, replaced by bleak moorlands that offered little shelter from the biting northern gales. The sheer abundance of the terrestrial world had been starved out of existence, forcing the remaining ecosystem to rely almost entirely upon the turbulent marine environment for its survival. Seabirds nested in deafening colonies along the newly formed, eroding cliffs. Their sharp cries echoed across a landscape that had lost the deep and resonant calls of terrestrial giants. The remaining flora clung desperately to the thinning topsoil, constantly battered by the corrosive sea spray that poisoned the very ground they needed to thrive. The earth itself seemed profoundly exhausted from its ancient, losing fight against the rising waters. For the small bands of human survivors marooned upon this fading outpost, existence had become a quiet exercise in profound endurance and isolation. They were the distant descendants of proud nomadic hunters who had once possessed an entire continent. They now found themselves trapped upon a tiny island that grew noticeably smaller with every passing winter storm. Their complex, ancient culture was fundamentally tied to a landscape that no longer existed. Their sacred hunting grounds and ancestral burial sites were hidden beneath hundreds of feet of freezing water. They fashioned their tools from the bones of seabirds and the scattered remnants of marine mammals. They lived a precarious day life, entirely dictated by the unpredictable moods of the surrounding sea. The deep psychological weight of their isolation must have been overwhelming as they stared out across the churning abyss. They knew with absolute certainty that there was nowhere left to retreat. They built their small, humble fires on the highest elevations of the remaining chalky ridges, perhaps wondering if there were other survivors out there in the misty distance. The once expansive human domain had been tragically reduced to a single, highly vulnerable stronghold, and every rising tide served as a grim reminder of their fleeting mortality in a drowning world. The comforting rustle of endless inland forests was replaced by the constant roar of breaking waves against the dying shore. These nomadic people were caught in the slow, suffocating grip of an expiring geological epoch. Despite the creeping devastation, a strange tranquility eventually settled over the isolated landmass. The weather patterns seemed to temporarily stabilise, offering the weary islanders a deceptive illusion of permanence. The grey waters of the surrounding ocean often lay completely still, mirroring the pale northern sky like a sheet of polished obsidian. It was a suffocating silence that felt incredibly heavy, as if the entire natural world was holding its breath in anticipation of something unseen. The quiet days stretched into months, bringing a sense of eerie peace to the final inhabitants of the drowned continent. They began to believe the worst of the great floods had finally passed them by. The peace held across the fragile archipelago, but it rested on a delicate geological imbalance that would not last forever. Beneath the calm, glassy surface of the distant northern sea, an unimaginable pressure was waiting to be unleashed. Around the year 6200 BC, the delicate geological balance that had temporarily spared the final remnants of Doggerland finally shattered. Far to the north, deep beneath the frigid waters off the rugged coast of present-day Norway, an underwater catastrophe of unimaginable proportions was quietly unfolding. The edge of the continental shelf, weakened by millennia of shifting glacial weights and accumulating marine sediments, suddenly gave way in a catastrophic collapse known to modern geologists as the Strega Slide. An area of the seabed roughly the size of a small country violently detached and plummeted into the abyssal depths of the Norwegian Sea. This sudden displacement of Earth moved hundreds of cubic miles of sediment in a matter of hours, creating a massive void that the surrounding ocean rushed to fill. The violent rearrangement of the ocean floor generated a kinetic shockwave of immense power, displacing billions of tons of salt water in every direction. It was a purely mechanical reaction of planetary physics, a massive readjustment of the Earth's crust that transferred its raw, destructive energy directly into the water column. This energy did not dissipate into the deep ocean, but instead travelled southward, rolling beneath the surface as a silent, invisible force gathering tremendous momentum as it moved toward the shallow basin of the North Sea. For the isolated inhabitants of Dogger Island, the morning of the event likely began with the same heavy, oppressive stillness that had characterized their recent generations. Yet, this fragile peace was soon broken by a profoundly unnatural phenomenon occurring along their dwindling shoreline. The dark, grey waters that constantly battered their chalky cliffs began to rapidly and inexplicably recede, pulling away from the land with a strange, terrifying speed. Vast tracts of muddy seafloor that had not seen the light of the sun for centuries were suddenly exposed to the cold air, revealing a desolate wasteland of stranded marine life and rotting kelp forests. The air grew entirely silent as the familiar, rhythmic crashing of the surf disappeared, replaced by the faint, eerie hissing of water draining away toward the northern horizon. The nomadic survivors, accustomed to reading the subtle moods of the natural world, would have stood upon their high ridges in profound confusion as the ocean seemingly emptied itself. They were unknowingly witnessing the massive wave drawing the surrounding waters into its swelling crest, pooling its terrifying strength before delivering the final blow. The sea had retreated not in surrender, but to gather the absolute fullness of its devastating wrath. When the ocean finally returned, it did not arrive as a creeping tide, but as a towering, continuous wall of dark water stretching endlessly across the northern horizon. The tsunami generated by the Strega Slide carried a monstrous wave that reached heights of nearly 20 metres as it hit the shallow coastal shelf of Dogger Island. To comprehend the sheer scale of this advancing deluge, one must imagine a towering structure of solid water, equivalent to a 6-story building, rolling relentlessly down a modern avenue in New York, carrying enough force to shear concrete from its foundations. It was an unstoppable, towering monolith of freezing salt water that roared with the deafening sound of a collapsing mountain. The wave struck the fragile island with an absolute, uncompromising finality, shattering the remaining limestone defences and surging effortlessly over the highest elevations. The humble hearths, the fragile shelters, and the last remaining physical memories of a once great continent were instantly swallowed by the crushing weight of the sea. There was no prolonged struggle and no possibility of escape from a force of such overwhelming magnitude. The sweeping waters entirely engulfed the landmass, erasing thousands of years of human habitation in a matter of violent, chaotic minutes. As the monumental surge of the tsunami eventually washed over the sunken land and dissipated further south, the violent churning of the ocean slowly began to subside. The dark, sediment-filled waters gradually settled back into a rhythmic motion, reflecting the cold light of the fading afternoon sun. Where a resilient island stronghold had stood just hours before, there was now only an endless, unbroken expanse of grey water stretching from the British Isles to the shores of continental Europe. The magnificent plains, the deep river valleys, and the final generations of the people who had called this place home were completely absorbed into the silent depths. Doggerland was entirely extinguished from the physical world, its rich biological and human history buried beneath thick layers of suffocating marine mud. The North Sea had finally claimed its absolute victory, creating a vast watery graveyard that would remain entirely undisturbed by human hands. The ancient continent was swallowed so completely that its very existence would fade entirely from human memory, passing into the realm of silent oblivion. It would remain locked away in the freezing darkness of the deep, waiting quietly in the mud for thousands of years, until the steel machines of a much later age accidentally scraped the seafloor. The violent energy of the Storegga slide had finally spent itself against the drowned contours of the lost continent. A profound and heavy stillness descended upon the newly formed expanse of the North Sea. It replaced the chaotic roar of destruction with the rhythmic, monotonous breathing of the ocean tides. Beneath the cold surface of the grey water, turbulent clouds of sediment slowly began to fall. They drifted downward like a heavy, suffocating snow. This slow rain of silt and sand settled over the shattered remnants of the limestone ridges. It filled in the deep river valleys that had once harboured generations of nomadic hunters. The sprawling forests of pine and birch were completely crushed by the immense weight of the saltwater column. They were gently blanketed by a thick, dark layer of marine mud. The vibrant green canopy of the Mesolithic era was gone. It was replaced by an eternal twilight, a silent abyss where only the faint rays of a distant sun could barely reach. The physical evidence of human survival was perfectly entombed within this anaerobic environment. It was completely sealed away from the decaying touch of the open air. The ocean acted as a magnificent silent curator. It preserved the tragic end of a vibrant world beneath a flawless seal of heavy water. As centuries seamlessly bled into millennia, the surface of the world above continued its relentless march forward. It remained completely ignorant of the vast ghost kingdom resting in the quiet depths below. The chaotic storms of autumn and the freezing winds of winter whipped across the restless North Sea. Yet these violent atmospheric tempests could not penetrate the profound sanctuary of the submerged land. Down in the absolute darkness, the ruined hearths and scattered flint tools lay perfectly motionless. They were completely undisturbed by the changing of the seasons or the shifting constellations overhead. The rich ecosystem that had once supported wandering herds of majestic mammoths was gone, and it was slowly replaced by the silent drifting of deep marine life. Blind creatures of the abyss wove slowly through the petrified remains of ancient tree trunks. The memory of the people who had built their lives upon these fertile plains evaporated entirely from humanity. They left behind no written records, no towering monuments, and no whispered myths to carry their legacy forward. Doggerland became a place that existed only in the permanent, freezing midnight of the ocean floor. It was an invisible empire, holding its secrets tight in the suffocating embrace of the oxygen-starved mud. While the ancient continent slept beneath its watery shroud, the human species evolved and expanded. They spread across the very shores that had once been connected by this submerged bridge of earth. Great empires rose along the coastlines of Europe. They built immense fleets of wooden ships that sailed directly over the drowned valleys. The sailors remained without the slightest awareness of the tragedy resting hundreds of feet below their keels. The mighty galleons of colonial powers and swift merchant vessels crossed this grey expanse of water. They treated it simply as a turbulent barrier rather than the roof of a forgotten ancestral home. The navigators charting these waters mapped the treacherous shoals and unpredictable currents. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they were tracing the outlines of flooded hills. They sailed above submerged river deltas, where their distant forefathers had once gathered around warm fires. The history of the world was written and rewritten entirely on dry land. Meanwhile, the grandest geological casualty of the ancient era remained perfectly hidden in plain sight. It was completely masked by the impenetrable, mirrored surface of the sea. For more than 8,000 years, this delicate equilibrium of forgetfulness held firm. The deep ocean fiercely guarded the silent monuments of the Mesolithic hunters. The shifting tides continued to deposit microscopic layers of marine snow. They added millimetre upon millimetre, to the heavy burial shroud covering the petrified forests. There was no reason to believe that this resting place would ever be disturbed. The depths of the North Sea were largely considered a barren wasteland devoid of any historical value. The people walking the bustling streets of modern coastal cities looked out at the rolling grey waves. They saw only a vast expanse of natural resources and a boundary separating distinct modern nations. The submerged continent had survived the crushing weight of the glaciers and the rising tides. It had endured the catastrophic violence of the Great Wave to find its ultimate peace in unbroken silence. The dark waters kept their profound secret securely hidden from the curious eyes of humanity. They preserved the frozen moment of destruction in a rare state of suspended animation. This absolute tranquility stretched continuously through the ages, keeping the ghosts of the lost continent safely anchored in the comforting dark. The silence of the deep seemed truly eternal, destined to last forever. That is, right up until the heavy steel machines of the modern age finally arrived to stir the slumbering seabed. In the late summer of 1931, the eternal silence of the submerged plains was finally shattered by the relentless grind of industrial progress. The North Sea, a notoriously unforgiving stretch of water mirroring the treacherous maritime expanses of the North Atlantic, was crowded with commercial vessels seeking their daily harvest. Among these working ships was the Kalinda, a sturdy steam-powered fishing trawler sailing out of the coastal town of Lowestoft. The men aboard were accustomed to the grueling rhythm of the sea, hauling heavy loads through bitter winds and freezing spray. They were completely unaware that their routine voyage would soon bridge a gap of more than 8,000 years, pulling a monumental secret from the suffocating grip of the dark water. The vessel was operating near the Ower Bank, a shallow sandbank situated roughly 25 miles off the eastern coast. Beneath the churning grey waves, the Kalinda dragged a massive steel-framed trawl net across the ocean floor. The heavy iron teeth of the dredge scraped blindly through the ancient silent darkness, tearing into the soft layers of marine mud and uncovering the petrified remnants of the lost forests. It was an act of mechanical violence that disturbed a cemetery of prehistoric life, sweeping up everything in its path. The powerful steam winches on the deck screamed in protest as the immense weight of the catch was hauled upward through 80 feet of freezing salt water. Breaking the surface with a chaotic splash, the suspended net swung over the wooden deck, releasing a cascading torrent of marine life, tangled seaweed, and ocean debris. As the exhausted crew members waded into the slippery pile to sort the silver fish, they encountered massive, cumbersome blocks of dark, compacted earth. The fishermen of the region referred to this heavy, fibrous material as moorlog. It was essentially ancient peat, the compressed organic remains of prehistoric freshwater bogs that often tore through expensive nets and offered absolutely no commercial value. Typically, these useless chunks of drowned soil were unceremoniously kicked back into the churning waves. However, on this particular September afternoon, one exceptionally dense block of moorlog struck the iron deck with a dull thud and fractured apart. As the dark mass of compressed ancient vegetation split open beneath the grey daylight, an anomaly was instantly revealed. Resting perfectly preserved within the damp, fibrous hollow of the shattered peat was an object that clearly did not belong to the natural detritus of the ocean floor. It was a pale, intricately carved length of solid bone, measuring exactly 22 centimetres. The master of the vessel, Pilgrim E. Lockwood, paused his heavy labour to kneel upon the wet planks and retrieve the startling artefact. The object was heavy and cold, standing in stark contrast to the rough stones that usually accompanied the deep-sea dredges. The damp air of the 20th century rushed over an item that had not felt the wind since the ice sheets melted. A closer inspection of the pale object revealed a level of sophisticated craftsmanship that defied the perceived emptiness of the deep sea. The piece of bone, later identified as a carefully shaped fragment of deer antler, was meticulously carved with a series of sharp, jagged barbs running along one edge. The deliberate angled cuts were unmistakably the careful work of human hands, designed with deadly precision to pierce flesh and anchor deeply into struggling prey. It was an ancient harpoon point, a vital tool of survival crafted by a master hunter who had once stalked wild game across a thriving woodland. This lethal instrument possessed an undeniable gravity, forcing the men to realise they were floating directly above a flooded civilization. And the accidental retrieval of this hunting tool proved that an entire human ecosystem lay perfectly preserved beneath the crushing weight of the tides. The physical proof was finally secured safely behind a pane of polished museum glass, safe from the corrosive salt. Yet this solitary weapon, pulled from the dark depths, was merely the first whisper of a sprawling, submerged empire that was now violently demanding to be redrawn in. For decades following the chance retrieval of the carved antler, the sunken realm remained a profound abstraction, a theoretical ghost haunting the margins of academic texts. The single hunting tool had proven that ancient hands once shaped the environment, yet the physical landscape of this lost continent was still entirely locked away beneath millions of tons of shifting grey saltwater. The North Sea fiercely guarded its topography, offering no visual references for the human mind to grasp the true scale of the prehistoric domain. The deep ocean floor was a realm of absolute darkness, where traditional archaeological methods were rendered completely useless against the crushing pressure and perpetual currents. It required an entirely new era of human ingenuity to pierce this impenetrable veil, shifting the pursuit of the past from the physical excavation of dirt to the digital interpretation of invisible sound. The transition from physical artifacts to intangible data marked the beginning of a modern resurrection, a slow and methodical peeling back of the ocean to reveal the drowned earth. The breakthrough did not arrive through the deliberate efforts of historians, but rather through the relentless industrial momentum of the modern energy sector. Immense survey vessels began to crisscross the turbulent surface of the sea, trailing long cables equipped with sophisticated acoustic sensors designed to map the deep geological strata for natural resources. These ships sent powerful pulses of sound down through the freezing water, acoustic waves that pierced the sandy seabed and bounced off the denser layers of ancient rock and compacted soil below. As the echoes returned to the surface, they carried complex mathematical signatures, raw data that unknowingly held the precise topography of the Mesolithic world. For years, these vast digital archives accumulated in the servers of petroleum companies, viewed simply as structural diagrams of subterranean potential. However, within these dense forests of data lay the fossilized contours of ancient riverbeds, rolling hills, and vast plains that had not seen the light of the sun for over 8,000 years. The true shape of the sunken empire was finally coaxed from the darkness when academic researchers gained access to this unprecedented wealth of seismic information. Driven by a monumental initiative known as the Europe's Lost Frontiers Project, a dedicated team of scientists based at the University of Bradford began the painstaking process of translating industrial acoustics into historical geography. Using advanced computer modelling and high-resolution three-dimensional software, they systematically stripped away the modern ocean layer by digital layer. It was a technological alchemy reminiscent of the early archaeologists who poured plaster into the hollow voids of volcanic ash to reveal the forms of fallen citizens, but operating on a scale that spanned thousands of square miles. The powerful supercomputers processed millions of data points, transforming abstract numerical values into a vivid, topographical reality that slowly materialized across glowing monitors. Through the sterile precision of modern technology, humanity had successfully drawn a map of a ghost, rendering the invisible visible and reclaiming a lost chapter of human expansion from the indifferent depths. The glowing terrain on the screens offered a silent testament to the resilience and vulnerability of those ancient people who had walked across a continent that now only existed as digital memory. The researchers could look at the simulated valleys and imagine the smoke of campfires rising into a twilight sky, perfectly aware that every inch of that green expanse was currently buried beneath the freezing, crushing weight of the North Sea. The meticulous mapping of Doggerland provided a profound sense of closure to the mystery of its existence, bringing the drowned hills back into the light of human awareness. Yet, this magnificent digital resurrection was a triumph of the modern age that ultimately served to point toward a much deeper, more inescapable truth about the fragile nature of the earth we currently walk upon. When we stand upon the shifting shores of the present day, gazing out toward the vast and indifferent horizon of the Atlantic, it is easy to imagine that the world beneath our feet is immutable and eternal. We build our sprawling coastal metropolises and bustling waterfront communities with an innate confidence, assuming that the boundaries of our nations are permanently carved into the stone of the earth. Yet the silent history written across the submerged plains of the North Sea serves as a profound and humbling reminder that the geography of our planet is merely a temporary arrangement. The ancient ghost continent of Doggerland teaches us that the greatest empires of nature and humanity are perpetually locked in a quiet, unrelenting negotiation with the rising tides. Yet, the story of the lost world is ultimately defined less by the melancholy of its destruction than by the enduring tenacity of human memory and scientific curiosity. Our fave. Though the towering pines and bustling hunting camps were crushed beneath millions of tons of water, the lives of those ancient people were not entirely erased from the chronicle of time. Alack. Through the accidental retrieval of a carved bone artifact by a humble fishing trawler and the breathtaking wizardry of modern acoustic mapping, the ghost continent was coaxed back into the light of human awareness. We have learned to read the silent language of the seabed, transforming invisible layers of sediment into a vivid, breathing portrait of our ancestral home. The technology of our own era has allowed us to reach across 8,000 years of dark water to touch the hands of those who walked the dry valleys before us. As the quiet hours deepen and the rhythmic breathing of the ocean continues its eternal tide against the distant shores, the memory of Doggerland slowly settles into a deep and comforting stillness. The lost continent remains suspended in its dark sanctuary beneath the grey waves, no longer forgotten by the world above, but resting in a state of eternal peace. It stands as a magnificent monument to a world that once was, a silent teacher whispering across the ages about the transient beauty of the land we call home. We are left with the quiet realization that every footstep we take today is mirrored by the ghosts of those who walked across a different world yesterday. The cycle of the earth continues its majestic, unhurried rotation, holding both the memory of what was lost and the silent promise of what is yet to come.